Shaka Zulu, a name that echoes through history, was born in the summer of 1787 in the heart of the Zulu Kingdom, now located in the Natal region of South Africa. His birth name was Shaka Senzanga Kona. Shaka's father Senzanga Kona was the chieftain of the Zulu clan. Senzanga Kona became the ruler of the clan in 1781, just a few years before Shaka's birth. In keeping with the customs of the time, Senzanga Kona had several wives and numerous children, many of whom were sons. Among them was Shaka, who despite his eventual rise to power, faced significant challenges from the very beginning. Shaka's mother Nandi was the daughter of Bebe, a chief from the Langeni tribe, a neighboring clan to the Zulu. However, Nandi was not one of Senzanga Kona's official wives when Shaka was conceived. This fact made Shaka an illegitimate child in the eyes of Zulu Wilachi. As a result, both Nandi and Shaka were ostracized by the clan, cast out during Shaka's early childhood. They led a nomadic life for a time, moving through various territories, before eventually seeking refuge with the Mthethwa people. It was among the Mthethwa that Shaka's true potential began to shine. During his youth he became an exceptional fighter, quickly rising through the ranks to join the Mthethwa warrior class. The Mthethwa, like the Zulu, were part of the broader Bantu group, and their society was based on cattle and military prowess. As a young man, Shaka's skills in combat were extraordinary, even for his age. However, it was not just his fighting abilities that set him apart, it was also his intense and violent nature. Shaka's mentor, Dingas Wayo, the leader of the Mthethwa, sent him and several others on a raid against the neighboring Amambata people. A raid intended to be a simple cattle theft, but Shaka, driven by a deep desire for violence, escalated the raid. His forces not only stole cattle but pursued the Amambata, killing many of them. Dingas Wayo, disapproving of Shaka's excessive brutality, reprimanded him, emphasizing that Mthethwa policy was not to annihilate other tribes, but to raid for resources, not lie. The Mthethwa and Zulu were both part of the broader Bantu migration, a group that spanned from the Congo in the north to the Cape of Good Hope in the south. Understanding the structure of Zulu society and the broader Bantu culture is key to understanding Shaka's rise and the formation of the Zulu Kingdom. In the late 18th century, the Zulus were not a unified people. They were divided into smaller clans, each managing its territory, and cattle were at the center of their society, considered both wealth and currency. Cattle formed the backbone of their economy. This period also marked significant population growth, which led to the Zulu people seeking new lands, often displacing the indigenous Khoikhoi people in the process. Though expanding their territory, the Zulu remained subordinate to the Nadwan people to the north. Zulu society was organized around cattle, and it was common for men to have multiple wives, as polygamy was a central aspect of their culture. The Zulu people worshipped ancestral spirits, believing that these spirits could manifest in the physical world, particularly during ceremonies led by witch doctors. Zulu warriors were central to the society, and every adult male fought as part of large, highly organized military formations known as impis. These warriors wielded long spears and shields made of cowhide, with little protection beyond their shield. As Shaka entered adulthood, he began to see his path to power. His birthright was complicated by his illegitimacy, and yet driven by ambition, Shaka sought to challenge the existing line of succession within his family. In 1816, Shaka was still under 20 years old when his father Senzanga Kona passed away. The leadership of the Zulu clan was initially passed to Segoshana, another of Senzanga Kona's sons, but Shaka, the outcast son, was determined to take his rightful place as the leader of the Zulu. With the support of his mentor Dingas Wayo, Shaka moved to assert his claim to the throne. This marked the beginning of his ruthless rise to power. Shaka had Segoshana assassinated, and with Dingas Wayo's military backing, he returned to the Zulu lands and began eliminating anyone who might oppose him. His rise was swift, and in 1816, Shaka took the throne, beginning a reign that would change the course of history for the Zulu Kingdom. Shaka's rise to power and the establishment of the Zulu Kingdom. Shaka Zulu's journey to power was not an easy one. After assuming leadership in 1816, he faced immediate challenges to his authority. His claim to the throne was contested by several of his half-brothers and rivals within the Zulu clan. With the aid of Dingus Wayo and the Mthethwa, Shaka quickly began consolidating power and eliminating his enemies. The Mthethwa, led by Dingus Wayo, played a pivotal role in Shaka's early reign. Their support was essential in helping Shaka solidify his leadership. However, it was not just political alliances that defined Shaka's rise to power, it was his military innovation and ability to forge alliances with other Bantu tribes. The Mthethwa, already a strong force, served as the perfect foundation upon which Shaka could build his growing kingdom. The Zulu-Mthethwa alliance proved beneficial for Shaka, providing him with the military backing he needed. In return, the Mthethwa enjoyed the benefits of Shaka's growing influence. As Shaka established his authority over the Zulu people, he began expanding the reach of his power. But this expansion would not be without conflict. The greatest challenge Shaka faced came from the Nadwan people, who had previously exerted influence over the Zulu. The Nadwanbwa, under King Zodwide, were a powerful force in the region and posed a significant threat to Shaka's rule. The two tribes had long-standing tensions, but it was in the late 1810s that the conflict would reach its peak. In 1817, the Mthethwa, now under Shaka's command, found themselves at war with the Nadwan. The early days of the war were characterized by a series of minor skirmishes, with both sides preparing for a decisive confrontation. This conflict would go on to define the early years of Shaka's reign and set the stage for the formation of the Zulu Kingdom. Shaka's military tactics were key to his success in this war. Though outnumbered, Shaka had a strategic advantage in his ability to organize his forces. He used guerrilla tactics to harry the Nadwan forces, harassing them with ambushes and surprise attacks. In addition, he ordered the destruction of crops and the displacement of livestock to starve the enemy and limit their resources. In 1818, the two sides met in a major battle at Jikokli Hill, located near present-day Ulundu. Zodwide, the Nadwan Peking, led an army of around 12,000 warriors, vastly outnumbering Shaka's forces, which numbered only 6,000. Despite the disparity in numbers, Shaka's strategic brilliance and innovations would play a pivotal role in the outcome of the battle. Shaka's forces took position on Jikokli Hill, utilizing the high ground to their advantage. This allowed them to resist the Nadwanbwa's advance, while avoiding the full force of their numerical superiority. Shaka also made use of a new military formation, the Bullhorn Formation. This formation involved two large wings of warriors flanking the enemy from both sides, encircling them and forcing them into a confined space. As the battle progressed, the Nadwanbwa's numerical advantage became a disadvantage. They became tightly packed, making them vulnerable to Shaka's archers and spearmen. The Zulu warriors, trained to fight in coordinated formations, executed the bullhorn tactic with precision. This allowed them to encircle the Nadwanbwa and decimate their forces. The defeat of the Nadwanbwa at Jikokli Hill marked a turning point in the conflict. Shaka's victory at Jikokli Hill established his reputation as a skilled and ruthless military leader. Following the battle, Shaka's forces continued their campaign against the Nadwanbwa, eventually leading to the collapse of their kingdom. Zodwide, the Nadwanbwa king, was forced to flee, and the Zulu people soon took control of the former Nadwanbwa. By 1819, Shaka had secured a vast swath of territory, stretching from the southern regions of modern-day South Africa to near the border of Mozambique. His military successes had led to the creation of a unified Zulu kingdom, marking the beginning of his rule as one of the most powerful leaders in southeastern Africa. Shaka's rise to power was not solely based on military conquests. It was also the result of his ability to build alliances with neighboring tribes. He incorporated other tribes into his growing kingdom through a mix of diplomacy and conquest. Some tribes, like the Mkhize, Sithole, and Tholi, were brought into the Zulu sphere of influence peacefully, as vassal states. Shaka's diplomatic skill was just as important as his military genius in expanding the Zulu kingdom. However, the Zulu kingdom's expansion came at a great cost. The wars Shaka waged were brutal, and the human toll was staggering. It is estimated that the wars between 1816 and 1828 resulted in tens of thousands of deaths, both among the Zulu people and their enemy. The term Mfikane, meaning the crushing or scattering, was coined to describe the widespread chaos and displacement caused by Shaka's conquests. Some estimates suggest that as many as 1 to 2 million people died during this period of violent upheaval. Shaka's military prowess was not limited to his ability to fight and conquer. His success lay in his ability to reform and innovate within the Zulu military system. One of his most significant reforms was the introduction of the shorter stabbing spear known as the eagle. This weapon, in combination with the traditional throwing spear, allowed Zulu warriors to engage more effectively in close-quarter combat. The Ikwa became a symbol of Zulu military might and helped Shaka's forces achieve victory in numerous battles. In addition to the Ikwa, Shaka introduced the bullhorn formation, which became a hallmark of Zulu military tactics. This formation allowed Shaka's forces to encircle and overwhelm their enemies, often turning the tide of battles in his favor. The bullhorn formation would become one of the most iconic military strategies in African history, demonstrating Shaka's ability to adapt and innovate. The expansion of the Zulu Kingdom and Shaka's military innovations. The consolidation of power by Shaka Zulu marked the beginning of a new era for the Zulu people and the broader region. By 1819, Shaka had firmly established his dominance over the lands stretching from Natal to the northern borders of what is now Mozambique, creating the foundation of a unified Zulu kingdom. However, despite these impressive gains, the Zulu kingdom was far from secure. As the 1820s began, Shaka faced multiple challenges that would test both his military ingenuity and his ability to maintain control over the newly established kingdom. Military expansion and the Mfikane, the period known as the Mfikane, meaning the crushing or the scattering, describes the chaotic wave of violence and upheaval that swept across southeastern Africa in the early 19th century, coinciding with Shaka's rise. While Shaka's military campaigns were crucial in driving the Mfikane, they were not solely responsible for the large-scale migrations and destruction that took place. However, his aggressive military tactics, territorial conquests, and the expansion of his kingdom played a major role in shaping the events of this tumultuous period. Shaka's wars of expansion were characterized by brutal force and devastating military tactics. His Impish military regiments, equipped with the newly developed Ikwa, short stabbing spear, were trained to fight with efficiency and ruthlessness. These warriors, known for their ability to form the bullhorn formation, quickly overwhelmed the neighboring tribes and incorporated them into the Zulu kingdom. The results of Shaka's conquests were profound. Entire populations were displaced, and smaller, less organized groups were either absorbed into the Zulu kingdom or driven out into other regions. The displaced groups often found themselves on the move, leading to large-scale migrations of peoples across southern Africa. This migration, in turn, led to further conflict and fragmentation as displaced groups clashed with each other over resources and territory. The repercussions of the Mfikane were felt throughout the region, creating lasting instability and social disruption. Innovations in military strategy. At the heart of Shaka's success as a military leader was his innovative approach to warfare. While traditional African armies often relied on basic tactics and small-scale skirmishes, Shaka transformed the Zulu military into a formidable force capable of engaging in large-scale battles. One of the most significant innovations introduced by Shaka was the use of the Ikwa, a short stabbing spear that replaced the traditional long-range throwing spear, the as. The Ikwa allowed Zulu warriors to engage in close combat with greater effectiveness, enabling them to fight in tight formations and strike their enemies with precision. Along with the development of new weapons, Shaka also revolutionized Zulu battle tactics. The bullhorn formation, one of Shaka's most famous innovations, allowed his warriors to envelop and destroy enemy forces. The formation involved three main sections: the chest, which engaged the enemy directly, and the horns on either side, which surrounded and trapped the enemy. This tactical maneuver proved to be highly effective, as it allowed Shaka's warriors to outflank and overwhelm much larger enemy forces. The Zulu military regiments, known as MPs, were divided by age and fighting ability, with the most experienced and skilled warriors at the center of the formation, and the younger, faster warriors on the wing. Shaka's emphasis on discipline and organization was also crucial in the success of his military campaigns. Zulu warriors were trained rigorously from a young age,
and they were required to fight in Shaka's wars from their teenage years. This ensured a steady supply of well-trained soldiers who could be mobilized at a moment's notice. Shaka's impis were highly coordinated, and the speed and agility with which they moved across the battlefield allowed them to launch swift and devastating attacks on their enemy. Shaka's military reforms were not limited to battlefield tactics. He also restructured Zulu society to support the demands of his growing empire. Zulu society became increasingly centralized, with power concentrated in the hands of the king and his closest ally. This centralization allowed Shaka to maintain control over a large and diverse kingdom while also ensuring that the military had the resources it needed to continue its campaigns of expansion. The impact of Shaka's military reforms. Shaka's military innovations had a far-reaching impact on the entire region. His tactics and weapons spread to neighboring tribes, many of which began to imitate the Zulu military system. This helped to spread Shaka's influence beyond the borders of his kingdom, but it also created new rivalries as other Bantu tribes adopted similar tactics and competed for dominance. The spread of Shaka's military reforms also led to a dramatic shift in the power dynamics of southeastern Africa, as traditional forms of governance and warfare were replaced by more centralized, militarized state. While Shaka's military conquests were undoubtedly impressive, they also came at a high cost. The wars he waged led to the deaths of tens of thousands, both among the Zulu and their enemies. The toll of Shaka's expansion was especially devastating to smaller, less organized tribes, which were either destroyed or absorbed into the growing Zulu Empire. The process of conquest and assimilation left a lasting mark on the region, creating a volatile environment that would persist for years to come. In addition to the human cost, Shaka's military campaigns also caused widespread social and economic disruption. As tribes were displaced and forced to relocate, their traditional ways of life were often disrupted. The Zulu Kingdom, now a formidable power in southeastern Africa, had to maintain a constant state of war to protect its borders and secure its position in the region. This cycle of warfare, driven by Shaka's ambition, left many in the kingdom exhausted and disillusioned by the relentless demands of the king. Shaka's diplomacy and expansion. Despite the relentless violence that marked his reign, Shaka also proved himself to be a skilled diplomat. His ability to forge alliances and incorporate other tribes into the Zulu Kingdom helped to solidify his power and create a more cohesive empire. Tribes such as the Mkhize, Sithole, and Thuli were brought into the Zulu sphere of influence through a mix of diplomacy and military pressure. These alliances allowed Shaka to expand the reach of his kingdom without the need for constant warfare. Shaka's diplomatic efforts were particularly significant in the context of European colonization. During the early 1820s, European traders and explorers began to make their way into the interior of southern Africa, establishing contact with the Zulu Kingdom. While Shaka's early interactions with Europeans were largely confined to trade, these encounters would become increasingly important as European imperialism began to make its presence felt in the region. European traders, particularly those from the Cape Colony, were eager to establish relations with the Zulu in order to expand their influence in trade networks. In 1824, a trading station was established at the future site of Durban on the Natal coast, formalizing the first direct lines of trade between the Zulus and European settlers. This would set the stage for further interactions between the Zulu Kingdom and European powers, particularly the British, who were expanding their influence in the region. Shaka's diplomacy allowed the Zulu Kingdom to interact with the growing European presence, without directly confronting the European power. However, as European settlement in southern Africa expanded, the Zulus would soon find themselves in conflict with both the Boers and the British, who were steadily encroaching on Zulu land. The rise of external threats and Shaka's decline. As the 1820s progressed, the Zulu Kingdom, which Shaka had built through sheer military might and strategic alliances, found itself increasingly entangled in the complex dynamics of southeastern Africa. Shaka's reign, marked by continuous territorial expansion and military innovation, now had to confront external threats from both within the region and from the growing European presence at the southern tip of the continent. The Boers and the British, encroachment from the southwest. The first external threat to Shaka's kingdom came from the Boers, Dutch-descended settlers in southern Africa, who had begun migrating away from British-controlled areas in the Cape Colony. These Voortrekkers or Boertrekkers sought new lands where they could establish their own independent republics free from British rule. The Zulus initially made contact with the Voortrekkers in the early 1830s, but these encounters quickly soured, primarily due to a combination of misunderstandings, competition for resources, and the Zulu desire to maintain control over their territory. The Boers, led by men such as Piet Retief, initially tried to coexist with the Zulus, establishing a series of trade agreements. However, as Boer settlements moved further northeast into Zulu-controlled lands, tensions began to rise. The Voortrekkers, who had a history of conflict with indigenous groups, were often less willing to accept Zulu authority, and this sparked hostilities between the two parties. In 1838, the situation culminated in a major conflict known as the Battle of Blood River, a pivotal moment in both Boer and Zulu history. Although Shaka did not live to see this conflict, the Boer migration, which began during his reign, contributed to the eventual downfall of the Zulu Kingdom. These Boers would later align with British imperial interests, which would prove to be another major challenge for Shaka's successors. Alongside the Boers, the growing British presence in the region posed a serious challenge to the Zulu Kingdom. The British had already established a foothold in southern Africa through the Cape Colony, and by the 1820s they were increasingly interested in expanding their territorial influence further north. The British were particularly interested in the strategic location of the Zulu Kingdom and its resources, and their influence in the region would only continue to grow. Shaka's changing relationship with the British. Shaka's initial interactions with the Europeans were largely cordial, primarily based on trade. However, as the British became more involved in the region's politics and economy, they began to play a more active role in the fate of the Zulu Kingdom. In 1824, a British trader named Francis Farewell established the first formal trading post in Zululand, which would become the modern city of Durban. This trading post marked the beginning of more consistent European interactions with the Zulus, but it also signaled the start of European encroachment on the Zulu Kingdom's territory. The British were keenly aware of Shaka's growing power and military prowess, and their interest in maintaining peaceful relations with the Zulu king was partly motivated by the desire to avoid conflict with such a powerful and aggressive force in southeastern Africa. The arrival of European settlers and traders brought the Zulus into closer contact with the outside world, but it also brought the prospect of future conflicts with European powers, particularly the Brit. Although Shaka managed to establish an understanding with European traders, it was clear that the Zulu Kingdom's interactions with Europeans were becoming increasingly complex. As the British Empire extended its influence in southern Africa, the question of how the Zulus would respond to British imperial ambitions remained unresolved. This uncertainty would come to a head in the 1830s, following Shaka's death. Shaka's mental decline and tyranny. While external threats loomed on the horizon, Shaka's internal rule began to deteriorate in the late 1820s. Following the death of his mother Nandi in 1827, Shaka's mental state became increasingly erratic. Shaka's deep grief and sense of loss for his mother sent him into a spiral of depression, paranoia and irrational behavior. His once impressive leadership now appeared unstable, and his reign took on a more tyrannical tone. Shaka's anger and sorrow manifested in a series of brutal decisions that alienated many of his closest allies. One of the most notorious aspects of this period was Shaka's demand for an extended period of mourning after his mother's death. The mourning period included the suspension of all agricultural activities, such as the planting of crops and the milking of cattle, which caused widespread famine in the kingdom. The shortage of food and resources led to discontent among the Zulu people and their military leader. Shaka also became increasingly violent toward those he perceived as disloyal or disrespectful. Reports from the period describe his cruelty, including the punishment of those who failed to show sufficient grief for his mother's death. In some cases, Shaka ordered executions or forced individuals to commit acts of self-harm, such as cutting off their own ears. This brutal behavior pushed many of his generals and close advisors to question his leadership. As Shaka's behavior became more erratic, discontent within the kingdom grew. Even some of Shaka's most trusted allies began to fear for their own lives. His paranoia escalated, and he became increasingly isolated, relying on a small circle of loyal followers to help him maintain control. Shaka's reign, once characterized by his strategic genius and military success, had become defined by excessive violence, cruelty, and instability. The assassination of Shaka Zulu. Shaka's rule came to a violent end in 1828, when he was assassinated by his half-brothers Dingain and Mimlanga. The assassination was the result of a conspiracy within Shaka's own family, fueled by fears of his erratic behavior and the growing discontent among the Zulu leadership. Dingain, who had been one of Shaka's trusted generals, led the plot to murder his brother. Along with Mimlangana and a group of co-conspirators, Dingain carried out the assassination on the afternoon of September 22. Shaka, who had been growing more paranoid and unstable, was caught off guard by the attack. It is said that Shaka, upon seeing the faces of his attackers, asked, "Children of my father, what is wrong?" Some accounts suggest he prophetically remarked, "Are you stabbing me, kings of the earth? You will come to an end through killing one another." Shaka was only 41 years old at the time of his death, but his reign had already left an indelible mark on the history of southeastern Africa. The kingdom he had built, through warfare, diplomacy and military innovations, would continue to exist for several more decades, but without Shaka's leadership, the Zulu Kingdom would face new challenges, both from within and from external threats.
The aftermath of Shaka's death and the Zulu Kingdom's struggle for survival. The assassination of Shaka Zulu in 1828 marked the end of an era for the Zulu Kingdom. While his death was a turning point, it set off a series of events that would determine the future of the kingdom he had built. Shaka's half-brother, Dingaini, swiftly took control of the Zulu throne. But his reign, though long, would be marked by internal turmoil and external threats that ultimately led to the downfall of the Zulu Kingdom, as Shaka had known it. Dingaini's rise to power. Dingaini, the instigator of Shaka's assassination, quickly consolidated power in the aftermath of his brother's death. As a seasoned military leader and Shaka's trusted general, Dingaini was well positioned to lead the Zulus. However, his rise to power was not without complications. The assassination of Shaka, while successful, was not universally supported among the Zulu leadership. Some members of the royal family and the military were disillusioned by the violent and abrupt nature of Shaka's end. Dingaini's rule began with an air of suspicion and paranoia, and it did not take long for his leadership to be tested. One of the immediate challenges Dingaini faced was securing his rule by eliminating any rivals, including members of the royal family who might lay claim to the throne. He executed several of Shaka's remaining relatives, reinforcing his power but also sowing further discord within the kingdom. The growing resentment toward Dingaini's increasingly ruthless rule would shape his reign and lead to significant instability. The Zulu Kingdom's first conflict with the Voortrekkers. The first major external threat that Dingaini faced was the increasing presence of the Voortrekkers, the Boer settlers moving northward from British-controlled Cape Colony. In 1836, a group of these Voortrekkers, led by Piet Retief, entered Zulu lands, ostensibly to negotiate a peaceful settlement and secure land for farming. The Zulus, already wary of European encroachment, were suspicious of the intentions of the Boer. Dingaini, intent on securing his power, saw the Voortrekkers as a threat to his rule. In early 1838, Dingaini invited Retief and his party to meet at his royal kraal, Umgungundlavu, under the pretext of negotiating a land agreement. However, during the meeting, Dingaini ordered the massacre of Retief and his entire delegation, accusing them of deceit and treachery. The betrayal would have dire consequences for the Zulu Kingdom. Retief's death sparked outrage among the Voortrekkers, who now sought vengeance. Under the leadership of Andries Pretorius, the Boers launched a series of attacks against Dingaini's forces. The most significant confrontation came in December 1838, at the Battle of Blood River, where a large Zulu army, estimated at 10,000 men, faced off against a much smaller Boer force of around. The Boers, armed with firearms and artillery, used their superior weaponry and tactics to inflict a crushing defeat on the Zulus. The Zulu casualties were significant, and the Boers emerged victorious, signaling the beginning of a long period of conflict between the Boers and the Zulu. The defeat at Blood River not only weakened Dingaini's position, but also cemented the Zulu Kingdom's vulnerability to further Boer incursions. In the aftermath of the battle, Dingaini's authority was further undermined, and his reign began to unravel. Dingani's downfall and the ascension of Impande. In the wake of the Boer victory at Blood River, Dingani's rule faced increasing opposition from within his own ranks. His failure to repel the Voortrekkers, and the growing dissatisfaction with his leadership, led to revolts among the Zulu military and some of his generals. One of these generals, Impande, a half-brother of Shaka and Dingani, seized the opportunity to challenge Dingani for the throne. Impande, who had been spared during Dingani's purges, allied himself with the Boers, who were eager to see Dingani's downfall. In 1840, after a brief but intense conflict, Dingani was overthrown, and Impande was declared king of the Zulu. Dingani fled northward, and eventually he was killed by forces loyal to Impande, solidifying Impande's rule over the Zulu Kingdom. Impande's reign marked a period of relative stability for the Zulu Kingdom, especially when compared to the chaos and bloodshed of Dingani's rule. He was able to maintain Zulu independence for a time, largely by balancing the conflicting pressures of the British, the Boers, and the internal factions within Zulu. Unlike his predecessors, Impande was more cautious in his dealings with European powers, opting for diplomacy rather than outright confrontation. The growing British threat, despite Impande's efforts to maintain peace, the increasing presence of the British Empire in southern Africa continued to pose a significant challenge to the Zulu Kingdom. British colonial interests in the Cape Colony were expanding, and the British government, having recently gained control over large areas of southern Africa, now set its sights on the Zulu Kingdom. The discovery of valuable resources like diamonds and gold in the region only increased British ambitions. In the early 1840s, the British annexed the Boer-controlled Natalia Republic, which had been established in the wake of the Zulu defeat at Blood River. The annexation of Natalia by the British further isolated the Zulus, as they now faced increasing pressure from both the Boers and the British. In 1842, the British consolidated their power in the region by imposing their authority over the Zulu Kingdom, compelling Impande to accept British protection. While this alliance helped preserve the Zulu Kingdom's sovereignty, it came at a cost. The Zulu were forced to recognize British influence and grant British settlers and traders greater access to Zulu lands. The legacy of Shaka and the Zulu Kingdom. By the time Impande passed away in 1872, the Zulu Kingdom had undergone significant change. The once powerful and independent kingdom established by Shaka had been significantly weakened by both internal strife and external pressure. Impande's successor, his son Cetshwayo, inherited a kingdom that was already beginning to face the consequences of colonial encroachment. Shaka's legacy, however, remained influential. The military reforms and innovations he introduced, such as the bullhorn formation and the shorter deadly Yakla spear, were still employed by the Zulu warrior. The sense of unity and martial prowess that Shaka instilled in his people remained a defining characteristic of the Zulu nation. But as the kingdom faced the realities of European imperialism, the Zulus could no longer rely solely on the strength of their military to resist colonial domination. The Anglo-Zulu War and the end of the Zulu Kingdom. The final chapter in the history of the Zulu Kingdom began in 1879, with the outbreak of the Anglo-Zulu War. This conflict would be the defining moment for both the Zulu nation and the British Empire's ambitions in southern Africa. Though the Zulu Kingdom had been severely weakened by internal strife and external pressures, it still possessed one of the most formidable military forces in the region. The war, which lasted only 6 months, would end with the destruction of the Zulu Kingdom as an independent. The outbreak of the Anglo-Zulu War. The roots of the Anglo-Zulu War can be traced back to the growing tensions between Cetshwayo, the Zulu king, and the British. By the late 1870s, the British had already established a strong presence in southern Africa, especially following the annexation of the Natalia Republic and their control over much of the Cape Colony. Their interest in Zulu land intensified as they sought to assert their dominance over the region. In 1878, Sir Bartle Frere, the British High Commissioner in southern Africa, sought to provoke a conflict with the Zulu Kingdom. He applied diplomatic pressure on Cetshwayo,
issuing a series of demands that would have effectively reduced the Zulu Kingdom to a vassal state of the British Empire. The most egregious of these demands was the disbandment of the Zulu army, and the dismantling of the traditional Zulu military system. Freire also demanded that the Zulu people accept a British resident at the Zulu court, essentially placing Cetshwayo's authority under British control. Cetshwayo, despite his recognition of British power, refused to comply with the ultimatum. He understood that accepting such terms would not only undermine his authority but also jeopardize the independence of the entire Zulu kingdom. As a result, the British, who were intent on expanding their influence, decided to act militarily. In December 1878, Freire delivered the ultimatum to Cetshwayo, and when it was rejected, the British launched their invasion of Zulu. The first invasion and the Battle of Isandlwana, the British army under the command of Lord Chelmsford, crossed the border into Zulu land in January 8. The invasion force was large, numbering around 16,000 troops, which included regular British soldiers, colonial units, and African auxiliaries. The British, confident in their superior technology, believed that the war would be a swift and decisive victory. They underestimated the strength of the Zulu forces, who were led by King Cetshwayo and commanded by his most experienced general. Cetshwayo, with a force of approximately 35,000 warriors, had a strategic advantage in his knowledge of the terrain and his highly disciplined military. Despite their relatively primitive weapons including spears and shields, the Zulu warriors were battle-hardened and well-trained, having fought numerous wars to defend their kingdom and expand their territory. The first major clash between the British and the Zulus occurred at the Battle of Isandlwana on January 20. Chelmsford had split his forces into several columns, with the main force of 1,800 men camped at Isandlwana. The British had set up camp without establishing proper defensive measures, underestimating the Zulu ability to launch a coordinated attack. The Zulu warriors, using their traditional bullhorn formation, surrounded the British camp, quickly overwhelming the defense. The British were caught off guard, and in the ensuing battle the Zulus inflicted a devastating defeat on the British forces. By the end of the battle, only a few hundred British soldiers managed to escape, while over 1,300 British and colonial troops were killed. The Zulu casualties, though significant, were not as high, with estimates ranging from 1,000 to 3,000 killed. The Battle of Isandlwana was one of the most significant defeats suffered by a British army during the night. It was a shocking demonstration of the power and effectiveness of the Zulu military, and it sent shockwaves throughout the British Empire. The Zulu victory, however, was short-lived. The British counter-offensive and the Battle of Rorke's Drift. Following the disaster at Isandlwana, Lord Chelmsford reorganized his forces and brought in reinforcement. In the wake of the defeat, a large British force attacked a mission station at Rorke's Drift, which was defended by just 150 British soldiers. The Zulu forces, having already fought a lengthy battle at Isandlwana, were exhausted, and this battle turned the tide in favor of the British. At Rorke's Drift, the British, using their superior firearms, successfully repelled the Zulu attack. Though the Zulus were unable to break the British defenses, they continued to inflict heavy casualties, with an estimated 500 Zulus killed in the battle. On the British side, only 17 soldiers lost their lives. This battle became one of the defining moments of the war, as it was later celebrated in British media and popular culture, including in the 19th. While the British managed to salvage some pride with the victory at Rorke's Drift, the war was far from over. Despite the Zulu victory at Isandlwana, the British had more troops and superior weaponry, which would ultimately prove decisive in the final stages of the conflict. The Battle of Ulundi and the fall of the Zulu Kingdom. After regrouping and reinforcing their forces, the British launched a second invasion into Zulu land in the early summer of 18. Lord Chelmsford, having learned from his mistakes, brought a larger and better prepared army, numbering over 20,000 men, including infantry, cavalry and artillery. In July, the British army moved towards the Zulu capital of Ulundi, where the final confrontation would take place. Cetshwayo, though weakened by the earlier defeats, still commanded a formidable force of over 13,000 warriors. The Zulu forces, however, were no match for the British firepower, which included Gatling guns and modern rifles. The Battle of Ulundi, fought on July 4, 1879, was a decisive British victory. The Zulu warriors, despite their bravery, were no match for the disciplined and well-armed British troops. The Zulu military tactics, which had been highly effective in the past, were rendered ineffective by the British firepower and military discipline. After a fierce battle, the Zulus were defeated, and Cetshwayo's kingdom came to an end. The British captured Ulundi, and Cetshwayo was captured and exiled to the Cape Colony. The defeat at Ulundi effectively destroyed the Zulu Kingdom as an independent entity, and the British subsequently annexed Zulu land, placing it under their direct control. The aftermath and the legacy of the Zulu Kingdom. In the aftermath of the Anglo-Zulu War, the Zulu Kingdom was left in ruins. The once great military power had been broken, and the kingdom was now a British protector. Cetshwayo, though briefly restored to the throne in 1883, was powerless to reclaim his kingdom. He died in 1884, and the Zulu Kingdom was officially annexed by the British in 18. The fall of the Zulu Kingdom marked the end of an era for one of Africa's most powerful and formidable states. Shaka's legacy, however, lived on. The military reforms and innovations he introduced had made the Zulus a force to be reckoned with, and they had managed to inflict one of the most significant defeats on the British. During the Zulu Kingdom's resistance to British colonialism, though ultimately unsuccessful, had left an indelible mark on history. The story of Shaka Zulu and the rise and fall of his kingdom remains a testament to the power of military innovation, the complexity of African kingdoms, and the struggles faced by indigenous peoples in the face of European imperialism. Thank you for following this journey through the rise and fall of the Zulu Kingdom. The story of Shaka Zulu remains one of the most captivating and powerful tales in African history, and we hope you have gained a deeper understanding of this remarkable era.